Elizabeth Warren brought up her heritage in national television, and John Kennedy asked one line she couldn't answer. The panel wasn't expecting it. The moderators tried to pivot, but the moment had already landed, and by the time the clip ended, the internet wasn't talking about education anymore. Which state are you watching from? Tap like, hit subscribe, and let's get into what really happened. It began as a clean panel: public education, budget priorities, bipartisan optics, Harvard backdrop, polished moderators, senators seated in a calm semicircle, each with a talking point in a glass of water. Elizabeth Warren had already spoken once. Her answers were steady, familiar, measured. But when the moderator turned back for a follow-up, something in her tone changed. "Look," Warren said, her voice tightening. "I've spent my life fighting for inclusion. I understand heritage. I live it." Nobody had asked. John Kennedy hadn't even looked up yet. He was flipping through a manila folder, but that single word, heritage, did what no education statistic had managed. It shifted the room. Warren's co-panelist leaned back slightly. One moderator paused as if waiting for a follow-up that might soften the edge. Warren continued, "Anyway, I know what it feels like to be overlooked. I've walked through institutions that told me I didn't belong. That's why I bring that experience to policy." Still, nobody had asked, but everyone had heard. The subtext wasn't subtle, and Kennedy knew it. He let a few more answers pass before sliding his folder to the table's edge. The moderator, clearly nervous now, motioned to him. "Senator Kennedy," he nodded. "I'll be brief," Kennedy said. "I just have one question for the senator from Massachusetts." Warren turned to face him fully. Kennedy's draw was calm, level, not aggressive, not baiting, but the room knew something was coming. "You mentioned your heritage," he began. "And I think everyone at this table wants to honor ancestry where it's authentic." A flicker crossed Warren's face. Kennedy continued, "So, I just want to ask, what tribe did you grow up with? Not file under, not reference. I mean, eat with, live around, answer to." Dead silence. Warren blinked once, then twice. "Well," she began, "I've always felt a deep connection to I didn't ask about feeling." Kennedy interrupted gently but firmly. "I asked about living." Warren looked toward the moderator, who didn't move. The cameras were live. The format wasn't built to deflect. Kennedy leaned back. No smirk. No gloating, just stillness. "I ask," he added, "because the policies we shape for underrepresented groups need to start from truth. Live truth." Warren inhaled slowly. "My background is well documented." Kennedy nodded again. "Yes, ma'am. And that's what makes the omission so loud." The moderator stammered. Let's pivot back to the education figures." But it was too late. The panel had already tilted online. And the clip was clipped. Kennedy's line circulated like a ricochet. "I didn't ask about feeling. I asked about living." Suddenly, no one was talking about test scores or school bonds. They were talking about ancestry. Authenticity in the quiet line that cracked a polished set wide open. And Warren, just 5 minutes into a routine appearance, was already playing defense. Elizabeth Warren had gone silent. The panel moved on, but she hadn't. Even as the next senator spoke about early literacy benchmarks, Warren's eyes kept drifting to the folder sitting in front of John Kennedy. It wasn't flashy, no stickers, no tabs, just a manila cover with a red string clasp. But Kennedy hadn't moved it. He hadn't opened it. He just let it sit there like a quiet witness. When the moderator tried to re-engage Warren on funding strategies, she nodded, spoke in soft bullet points, but her answers were flat. Then Kennedy did something no one expected. He unfastened the string slowly, deliberately, and he slid one page out, not a thick report, not a speech, but a single page printed with 2 short paragraphs and a map. He didn't read from it. He didn't quote it. He simply extended it toward Warren and said, "I think this belongs in context, Senator." She blinked, took it. The camera zoomed just enough to show the top line. 2018 enrollment trends. Cherokee Nation's Harvard staff affiliations. A strange pair of metrics, but on the page, they spoke louder than any accusation. The first paragraph showed a steep rise in officially enrolled Cherokee Nation members based on documentation, residency, and tribal recognition. The second paragraph, in contrast, showed a tally of self-reported Native American identifiers on Ivy League faculty intake forms over the same decade. Warren looked up, her lips parted as if to speak, but Kennedy gently waved his hand. "Just read it," he said, the way our staff did. She scanned the footnote. It listed internal discrepancies, flagged applications, and a quietly shelved university memo suggesting heritage claims may reflect family lore rather than federal recognition. The moderator, visibly pale now, attempted to move things forward. But Kennedy wasn't done. He turned to the camera, not the panel, and said, "We talk a lot about who gets a voice, but if the microphone's being held by someone who skipped the line, that's not inclusion. That's impersonation." Gasps, not from the audience, there wasn't one, but from the production team behind the glass, whose movements slowed as if they, too, realized the segment had just become a story. Warren folded the page and handed it back. "I've answered questions about this for years," she said carefully. Kennedy accepted the page, but didn't put it back in the folder. Instead, he laid it flat on the desk and said, "Then one more answer won't be too hard. That line didn't trend yet, but the clip did. Not because of shouting or grandstanding or fury, but because one folder closed then opened did more damage than a dozen press conferences." Backstage, a producer whispered into a headset, "We're not editing that out, are we?" Pause, then too late. The live stream caught it. Elizabeth Warren had been through this before. She knew the cadence, the media flurry, the framing wars, and this time she tried to get ahead of it. As the panel resumed, she leaned toward her mic with a practiced calm. "I've always acknowledged that the stories I grew up with about my family's background were passed down with love," she said. "They weren't meant to hurt anyone. They were simply a part of how I understood myself. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't emotional. It was calibrated." Kennedy said nothing. Warren continued, "And yes, I've said before, I listed myself as Native American in a few faculty directories. It was never for advantage, never for gain. It was identity, not leverage." Now Kennedy moved. He turned the page on his folder just once, and pulled out a second document. This time it was dated, bold at the top, April 19, 1995. He held it up without speaking. The moderator squinted, then leaned closer. Kennedy placed it flat on the desk. "This," he said softly, "is the year Harvard Law School celebrated its first woman of color as a tenor professor." Warren's jaw tensed. The document wasn't a hit piece. It was a university newsletter scanned, archived, forgotten by most. But Kennedy had circled a quote near the bottom. A sentence that read, "Dean Robert C. Clark praised Warren's appointment as part of the school's continuing commitment to diversity, noting her Native American background." Warren leaned forward. "That's not how I remember that conversation." Kennedy replied without blinking. "I didn't say it was your memory. I said it was Harvard's quote." The moderator jumped in. "Senator Kennedy, we want to keep this focused on public policy." Kennedy raised his hand gently. This goes to the heart of policy. Who writes it? Who gets trusted to lead it?" Warren now looked frustrated. "We're in a time when women's voices, especially those who've faced systemic exclusion, are constantly being picked apart." Kennedy didn't react. Instead, he tapped the date again. 1995, he repeated. "That was when the label you now say didn't matter was doing quite a bit of work." Warren tried to counter, but her voice stumbled slightly. "I was qualified. My record." "I'm not questioning your qualifications," Kennedy said. "I'm questioning the narrative that keeps shifting. That landed not with volume, not with drama, but with the kind of precision that quiets everyone else." The moderator tried to regain control. "Kay will pivot to school safety." But even on Twitter, the conversation had already mutated. Someone had posted a screenshot of the 1995 quote, alongside a clip from Warren's 2020 presidential campaign where she denied ever benefiting from her claimed ancestry. The caption read, "Then versus then. No hashtags, no insults, just the timeline." Kennedy didn't post it, Didn't even glance at a phone. He just folded the newsletter, placed it back in his folder and said, "Moving on." But nobody else was. By now, the panel had lost its original theme. The room was still talking about education, but not in the way the planners had hoped. The moderators, clearly rattled, tried to redirect the next question towards state curriculum guidelines. But Elizabeth Warren wasn't ready to let it go. "There's a difference," she said clearly, "between personal heritage and federal recognition. I've always acknowledged that. And for the record, I did take a DNA test. The report is public." She looked directly at the camera now, not at Kennedy. "I released it because I believed in transparency. Even if it wasn't perfect, even if some people mocked it, I stood by the truth." Kennedy didn't mock her. He didn't even look up. He simply opened his folder again. One sheet, double-sided white paper, red underline, and for the first time he read aloud. "This is from the Boston Globe's coverage of your day test." He said the analysis found that Warren likely had a Native American ancestor 6 to 10 generations ago. He paused. "That's somewhere between 164th and 1124th. The number hung in the air like a drop pin. "I'm no mathematician," Kennedy continued, "but I'm fairly sure my uncle's goldfish has stronger tribal affiliations." A few chuckles rippled through the press row. Not the panel. Warren didn't smile. She took a slow breath. "I did what people told me to do. I provided evidence. Faced it." Kennedy nodded once. "Sure, but the problem isn't the test. It's how many doors that fraction unlocked." He flipped the paper to the other side. "Here's where it gets interesting. This side cites the genealogical records you referenced in 2012, documents your own campaign provided, and not one of them lists a tribal roll number. Not one lists a reservation. Not one connects to enrollment criteria under the BIA." Warren stiffened. "I'm not enrolled in a tribe. I never claimed to be. I've said that multiple times." Kennedy gently raised the sheet again. "Then what did Harvard mean when they said they were proud to have a woman of color on staff?" She didn't answer. Instead, Warren glanced toward the moderator who stared straight ahead. Kennedy continued, "This isn't about gotchas, Senator. It's about clarity, because if 116th becomes a headline and 1000th becomes policy influence, then our standards are paper thin." The moderator finally broke in. "Okay, let's reset the tone. We're going to pivot to early education access now." But Kennedy wasn't done. He folded the sheet one last time and said, "If someone wants to lead conversations about underrepresentation, they need to come from somewhere other than fiction." Warren's lips parted in disbelief. She leaned toward her mic, then paused again and didn't speak. It wasn't even the sentence itself that did it. It was the way Kennedy said it. Quiet, no emphasis, no spike in tone, like he was reading off a shopping list. But before we get to that, here's how the room set itself up. The moderator, now visibly flustered, tried once more to steer the panel back to safer ground. "We'll now move to solutions for rural education disparity." But no one was listening. Warren sat forward, elbows on the table, hands clasped tightly. Kennedy was flipping through his folder calmly, as if nothing he had said in the last 10 minutes had changed the entire room's oxygen. One of the panelists leaned toward a producer off-screen and mouthed, "Do we cut?" The producer didn't respond. And then it happened. Warren, in what some in the press room would later call a final swing, straightened her spine and said, "I am proud of every part of my story, even the messy parts. I didn't ask for a spotlight. I didn't demand labels. I worked, taught, and I earned my place." Kennedy didn't even look up. He simply slid a fresh document onto the desk. A copy of a 1996 university internal review marked confidential, not for distribution, leaked clearly but real. He didn't raise his voice, didn't even hold it up. He just tapped the third paragraph. The moderator squinted, adjusted her glasses. It read, "The Faculty Review Committee has received inquiries from alumni and donors regarding Professor Warren's claimed ancestry. This continues to be a point of both celebration and concern within our recruitment narrative." Warren blinked. Kennedy waited. And then he said it. The one line, not loud, not dramatic, just deliberate. If your story was only ever about pride, why did someone else's money have to tell it? You could hear the breath catch in 3 corners of the studio. Even the intern manning the live stream delay button froze because no one was sure if that line violated decorum or rewrote it entirely. Warren tried to reply, but there was nothing to refute. The document was real. The quote was printed, and the question wasn't rhetorical. It was surgical. In the green room, one of the segment producers stood, head set off, and muttered, "He just ended the second act." Behind the glass, a showrunner quietly said, "We lost her." Not because Warren stormed off, not because she yelled, but because Kennedy had landed a sentence so precise, so rooted in her own team's archives that it rendered everything else weightless. Even the moderator paused longer than protocol allowed, then finally said, Let's shift now to equity in district funding." Too late. The internet had already clipped it. The timestamps were already circulating. The segment was no longer about school policy or representation or historical correction. It was about one question, 12 words, and the silence that followed. Nobody remembered this district funding segment. Nobody tweeted the next question because 30 seconds after Kennedy dropped his final line, a still frame began circulating. Not a meme, not a video, just a screenshot. The camera had caught Warren mid-reaction. Blink caught too long. A furrow that hadn't finished forming. Kennedy wasn't even visible in the frame. Only her and one sentence beneath the image. If your story was only ever about pride, why did someone else's money have to tell it? By the time the panel wrapped, the clip had crossed 2 million views on one X account alone. College students reposted it on TikTok, stitching themselves silently watching the exchange. Instagram pages clipped the moment like it was courtroom drama. But the real turn came 24 hours later. That's when an archivist at the university, unaffiliated with the broadcast, unaffiliated with politics, shared a post on the university's internal forum. It was simple. "We've officially received more Save FOIA-style requests for internal correspondence on this one professor than for any other faculty in the last 20 years. The post was deleted within an hour, but not before screenshots landed on Reddit, 4chan, Substack, and Telegram. And just like that, the hearing became a case study. A journalism professor at NYU assigned the clip in a media ethics class. A law student in Texas wrote a blog post on what qualifies as identity-based advancement. An op-ed in the Chicago Tribune asked, "Can a myth be ethical if it's been personally believed?" Elizabeth Warren didn't respond publicly. Her office issued a general statement about focusing on real issues impacting working families. But the silence felt louder now because Kennedy hadn't launched an attack. He hadn't raised his voice or issued a press release or staged a follow-up media blitz. He had simply asked a question on a stage with a document and disappeared. Even the show's producers noticed something unusual. That specific segment had the highest watch-rough rate of any show they'd aired that month, and the fewest interruptions. No ad cuts, no panelist banter, just static silence, and that single line reverberating through public discourse. By week's end, 2 education nonprofits had removed Warren from their advisory boards. Not because of guilt, not because of pressure, but because, as one internal email put it, "We can't afford this debate becoming a distraction from the cause." The irony, that was Kennedy's entire point. They wrapped the panel with polite smiles. The moderator thanked everyone. The outro music played low under her voice. The producers cut to a soft focus montage of school children in classrooms, markers on whiteboards, backpacks on hooks, flags near windows. But no one in the studio was watching. Not really, because everyone, every intern, every stagehand, every segment producer in the control room knew exactly what people would be talking about the next morning. And it wasn't the new math curriculum. It was the question, the 12 words, the shot across the bow. If your story was only ever about pride, why did someone else's money have to tell women? It wasn't angry. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't loud. It was the kind of question that doesn't just poke at policy. It asks whether the story you're telling is still yours. Warren didn't answer it. Not during the segment, not after. But that didn't stop the answer from forming. Not in quotes, but in retractions. Over the next 2 weeks, more than a dozen blogs, organizations, and university bios removed or rewarded old descriptors. Some deleted them entirely. Even a few newsrooms quietly issued edits to past coverage, tweaking lines that once described her with proud tribal affiliations. They didn't retract, they just adjusted. But the question was still there, alive in comment sections woven into think pieces about identity, merit, and narrative. Because that's what Kennedy had done. He hadn't won a debate. He'd left behind a paradox. He'd asked whether a personal belief stated enough times becomes a public credential. And if so, when does the system start treating it like fact? The applause had ended, but the question hadn't. Even on campuses where Warren remained an icon, professors were now adding disclaimers. Even in editorial rooms, segment producers were holding longer pre- and prep sessions because everyone knew what might come next. A folder, a line, a moment that rewrites a story. Not by yelling over it, but by reading what was already there. And as for Kennedy, he was back in Louisiana fishing. Didn't post a word. But that sentence he asked, that unblinking challenge, was still echoing. Not because it was clever, because it was true. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button for more emotional, dramatic, and unexpected tales. And thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.